Welcome to the Stillness Broadcast. Tonight we gather in the spaces where memory becomes unreliable, where the familiar turns foreign, and where the boundaries between what we are and what we're becoming grow dangerously thin. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. There's something profound about knowing we're scattered across the world, but gathered here in the dark together. Some of you are watching dawn break. Others are deep in the hours when the world feels like it belongs only to you and whatever else is awake. If you find yourself returning to these stories, consider subscribing. We're here every week, waiting in the dark. Let's begin. Story 1. Graham Vickers stood at the loading dock of the Valdosta Community Center, watching his breath condense in the November air. The fog had rolled in early that year, thick enough that the parking lot lights created isolated spheres of visibility, everything beyond them reduced to suggestion and shadow. At 49, recently terminated from his quality assurance position at a pharmaceutical company, Graham had discovered that organizing charity drives was both meaningful work and a way to fill days that would otherwise be empty. The winter clothing drive was his 6th. He took pride in the organization of it. The sorting protocols, the inventory logs, the distribution schedules that ensured nothing was wasted. He was meticulous by nature. His logs were color-coded. His donation receipts were filed chronologically. Control was comfort when everything else felt uncertain. The divorce had been finalized 6 months ago. His daughter, Bethany, no longer returned his calls. The charity work was all that remained of his identity as someone who helped, someone who mattered. More coming in. Marcus, the young volunteer, appeared through the fog, pushing a dolly stacked with black garbage bags. 23 years, old, perpetually cheerful in the way of people who hadn't yet learned that optimism was a limited resource. These are from the estate sale on Tomb Street. The whole house, basically. Graham checked his tablet. The Tomb Street donation wasn't scheduled until tomorrow. His jaw tightened. Deviation from schedule created inefficiency. "They're early," he said. "Yeah, the family wanted it gone today. Something about needing the house cleared." Marcus shrugged, already unloading. "It's a lot of stuff, but it's quality. Designer labels, hardly worn." The bag smelled of lavender and mothballs and something else Graham couldn't quite identify. Something faintly chemical, like cleaning products left too long in a closed space. He made a note on his tablet. Tomb Street donation. Early delivery. Inspect for quality. They spent the next hour sorting. Graham worked with methodical precision, examining each item for stains, tears, missing buttons. Most of it was remarkable. Cashmere sweaters, wool coats with designer labels, leather gloves soft as butter, the kind of clothes that suggested wealth, taste, careful maintenance. "Weird that someone would just donate all this," Marcus said, holding up a coat that probably cost more than Graham made in a week at his old job. "Most of this stuff is practically new." Graham didn't respond. People donated for all kinds of reasons. Death, usually. Sometimes divorce. Sometimes they just wanted to erase the past. The coat Marcus held was beautiful. Charcoal gray wool with black velvet collar. Tailored cut, pristine condition. Graham reached for it, checking the label. His fingers brushed the lining and came away with something powdery. He rubbed his thumb against his fingertips, frowning. "What is that?" Marcus asked. "Probably just dust." But it didn't feel like dust. It felt finer, more uniform. Almost like talcum powder, but with a faint, oily residue. Graham wiped his hand on his... ripped jeans and continued sorting. By 10 p.m., they'd processed most of the donation. Graham sent Marcus home and stayed to complete the inventory logs. The community center was quiet at that hour, just the hum of fluorescent lights and the building settling with sounds like small bones breaking. He was logging the last items when his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but old habits from his QA days kicked in. You always answered, because it might be important. Mr. Vickers? A woman's voice, professional but strained. This is Patricia Dennison. I'm the estate administrator for the Tomb Street property. I need to speak with you about the donation we delivered today. Graham pulled up his notes. Yes, it arrived early, but everything seems to be in order. We're grateful for the... You need to destroy those items. Her voice was sharp now, urgent. Everything from that house needs to be incinerated. I'm calling the waste management facility in the morning, but I wanted to warn you first. Don't distribute any of it. Don't let anyone try it on. Ideally, don't touch it with bare hands. Graham's skin prickled. I don't understand. Is there some kind of contamination? Silence on the line, long enough that he thought she'd hung up. Then, the woman who lived there, Caroline Marsh, died 6 weeks ago, but I only discovered the body yesterday. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Graham became aware of the smell of the clothes hanging on racks around him. Lavender and mothballs and that chemical note underneath. I'm required by law to disclose certain information to anyone who might have been exposed. Patricia continued. Ms. Marsh was a chemist before she retired. The house contained substances. The police are still cataloging everything, but there's evidence she was conducting experiments. Some of the compounds are unknown. The hazmat team found traces throughout the house, concentrated in the bedroom and closet. Everything was contaminated. Graham looked at his hands. He'd been touching those clothes for hours. That powder on the coat lining, he'd rubbed it between his fingers, probably breathed it in. What kind of compounds? His voice came out steady, but his heart was hammering. They're still being analyzed. The preliminary results suggest neurotoxins, but modified. Synthetic analogs of naturally occurring substances. The team said they've never seen anything quite like it. Patricia's voice dropped. Ms. Marsh kept journals. They're disturbing. She was testing the compounds on herself, documenting the effects. Effects? Graham's mouth tasted like copper. Neurological changes, perception alterations. She wrote about achieving states of consciousness that transcended normal human experience. But toward the end, the entries became incoherent. Just drawings mostly. The same image repeated hundreds of times. Graham didn't want to ask, but he couldn't stop himself. What image? A door. Always a door. Sometimes it was open, sometimes closed. Sometimes there was something standing in the doorway, but the drawings weren't clear enough to tell what. The phone call ended with Patricia promising to send an official notice and contact information for poison control. Graham stood in the empty community center, surrounded by racks of contaminated clothing, and tried to remember exactly how many items he'd touched. How much of that powder had gotten on his hands, under his fingernails, absorbed through his skin. The smart thing would be to leave immediately, shower thoroughly, call poison control, but Graham had spent his entire career in quality assurance. Protocol was everything. He needed to document what had happened, secure the contaminated items, update the logs. He was photographing the donation bags when he noticed the smell had changed. The lavender was stronger, Now, almost overwhelming, and underneath it, that chemical note had intensified into something that made his eyes water. No, his eyes weren't watering. They were burning. Graham grabbed his tablet and headed for the exit, but stopped 3 steps from the door. Marcus had left one of the bags open, clothes spilling onto the concrete floor. Graham's organizational instinct screamed at the disorder, but his survival instinct said leave it. Leave everything. Get out. He compromised by kicking the clothes back toward the bag. His shoe caught on something. A scarf, silk, the color of rust. It wrapped around his ankle like it had weight and intention. He bent to untangle it, and the smell intensified. Not lavender anymore. This was wrong lavender, artificial lavender, lavender as imagined by something that had never actually smelled flowers. Graham's vision blurred. He blinked hard, trying to clear it, and when his eyes focused again, the community center looked different. Fluorescent lights cast shadows that fell in wrong directions. The racks of clothes seemed closer together than they'd been seconds ago, creating narrow aisles that suggested passages leading somewhere the room was too small to contain. Neurotoxin. He was experiencing neurological effects. He needed to get to a hospital. But when he looked at the exit door, it didn't look like the exit anymore. It looked like a door in a house he'd never visited. Brown wood with a brass knocker shaped like a closed fist. And beside it stood a figure. No, not a figure, just a shadow, just the way the light fell across the coat rack. Except coat racks didn't breathe. Graham ran. He hit the actual exit door hard enough to bruise his shoulder, spilled out into the parking lot, and immediately vomited into the fog. His hands shook as he called 911, his words tumbling over each other. Contamination, neurotoxin, hallucinations. The ambulance arrived in 7 minutes. The paramedics took his vitals, asked questions about what he'd been exposed to, started an IV. Graham lay on the gurney watching the community center recede as they drove away. And through the bay door he could see the clothes still hanging on their racks, innocent and patient. One of the paramedics kept talking to him, asking him to describe what he was feeling. Graham tried to focus on her questions, but his attention kept sliding away to the ambulance windows. The fog outside was thick enough that he couldn't see the road, couldn't see other cars, could only see the lights of the ambulance reflecting back at them from the white nothing. "We're taking you to South Georgia Medical," the paramedic said. "Stay with me, Mr. Vickers. Keep talking. Tell me about the clothes. What did they look like?" "Expensive," Graham heard himself say. "Well maintained. The kind of clothes someone wore when they still cared about appearing normal." "And the powder you mentioned?" "On the lining, the interior surfaces, where it would touch skin." Graham's tongue felt thick. She put it there deliberately, treated every item. Probably took months. Who did? Caroline Marsh, the chemist. She was testing something, documenting effects, achieving altered consciousness. The words came easier now, like someone else was speaking through his mouth. She saw something, drew it hundreds of times. A door. "Mr. Vickers, your pupils are..." "There's a door in the fog," Graham interrupted. "Can you see it? It's right there." But the paramedic wasn't looking at the fog. She was looking at him, and her expression suggested she was seeing something that worried her professionally. "There's no door," she said carefully. "Just fog. We're almost at the hospital." Graham wanted to argue, to point at the shape forming in the white nothing outside the window, but his arm wouldn't move properly. His whole body felt distant, like he was operating it remotely through degrading signal. The hospital was bright and loud and full of people asking questions. They drew blood, took scans, consulted with poison control. A doctor with tired eyes explained that without knowing the exact compound, treatment would be supportive, fluids, monitoring, management of symptoms. They'd keep him for observation. Most neurotoxins either killed you quickly or you recovered. The question was which one he'd been exposed to. They put him in a room on the 4th floor. Graham lay in the narrow bed, watching dawn break over Valdosta through a window that looked out at the parking lot, and beyond it, the pine forests that stretched for miles. The ivy dripped clear fluid into his arm. Machines beeped softly. Everything was normal and clinical and real, except for the door. It appeared first as a shadow on the wall opposite his bed. Nothing unusual, just the way the light from the hallway fell across the white paint. But as he watched, it darkened and defined itself. The outline of a frame, a suggestion of depth, the sense that it was recessed slightly, set into space that shouldn't exist behind plaster and drywall. Graham closed his eyes. Hallucination. Toxin-induced perception alteration. His brain was misfiring, creating images from nothing. He knew this. He understood the mechanism. That understanding should protect him. But when he opened his eyes, the door was more solid. Brown wood, brass hardware, closed, but somehow suggesting it wouldn't stay that way. A nurse came in to check his vitals, cheerful and efficient, and didn't glance at the wall. Because there was nothing there. Graham knew this. He was experiencing a persistent visual hallucination, probably accompanied by mild dissociation and compromised reality testing. The nurse left. The door remained. Graham spent 3 days in the hospital. The hallucination, because he refused to call it anything else, came and went. Sometimes the wall was just a wall. Sometimes the door was there, closed. Once, he woke at 3:47 a.m. to find it open, revealing darkness that seemed to extend further than the wall's depth should allow. He didn't tell anyone. Tests were showing improvement. The toxin, whatever it had been, was clearing his system. He'd recover fully, the doctor said. He just needed rest. On the 4th day, they released him. Graham went home to his apartment, small and empty, and exactly as he'd left it. He showered for 40 minutes, scrubbing until his skin was raw. He bagged all the clothes he'd worn that day and left them by the door for hazmat disposal. He tried to sleep. The door appeared on his bedroom wall at 11:32 p.m. This time when it opened, something was standing in the darkness beyond. Not clearly visible. His eyes slid away when he tried to focus on it. But present, occupationally there, like it had business with him. Graham turned on every light in his apartment. He called the hospital. He tried to explain that he was still experiencing symptoms, that he needed to come back. The night nurse was kind but firm. His discharge paperwork indicated he'd made a full recovery. If symptoms worsened, he should return to the ER. "The door's open now," Graham said. "There's something in it." Silence on the line. Then gently, "Mr. Vickers, have you been taking the medication we prescribed? The anxiolytics?" He had. They didn't help, because this wasn't anxiety. This was something the toxin had opened inside him. Some doorway in his perception that wouldn't close. Graham spent the rest of the night researching Caroline Marsh. There wasn't much. Obituary without details. A few academic papers from decades ago about synthetic neural compounds. But he found one article that made his hands stop working properly. It was from a chemistry journal published 8 years ago. Caroline Marsh writing about theoretical compounds that could alter consciousness by changing how the brain processed sensory input. Not creating hallucinations, she argued, but removing filters, allowing perception of things that existed outside normal human sensory range. The article concluded with a quote Graham read 3 times. "We assume our senses show us reality, but what if they only show us the narrow slice of reality our species evolved to navigate? What if there are doors we can't see because we're not supposed to see them? What if I could make you see?" His phone rang. Unknown number. Graham stared at it for 5 rings before answering. Static on the line. Then, underneath it, something that might have been breathing. "Hello?" His voice cracked. The static resolved into a voice. Patricia Dennison, the estate administrator, but with something wrong about the cadence. "Mr. Vickers, have you seen it yet?" "Seen what?" "The door. She left them everywhere. In the house, in the items, in everyone who touched them. Little doorways carved into perception. Most people never notice. But you're looking, aren't you? You've been looking directly at it." "This isn't real," Graham said. "I was contaminated. I'm experiencing persistent hallucinations due to neurotoxin exposure." That's what she thought at first, too. Patricia's voice was dreamy now, distant. "That's what I thought when I found her body. 6 weeks dead, but the door in her bedroom was so clear, so detailed. I walked through it." "You walked?" "There are things on the other side, Mr. Vickers. Things that have been waiting for someone to open the way." Caroline opened it in herself first, then in her belongings, then in everyone who would touch what she touched. Doors in their perception, cracks in their filtered reality, and things come through cracks. Graham hung up. He blocked the number. He turned off his phone. The door on his bedroom wall was wide open now, and the thing standing in it was close enough that he could see it didn't have features so much as suggestions of where features should be. Too many or too few, shifting every time he tried to count. He left his apartment, drove to a hotel, checked in. The room was clean and anonymous, and the walls were blank, until 3:47 a.m., when the door appeared. Graham tried moving again. Different hotel. Same result. He tried staying with his sister in Macon. The door appeared on her guest room wall, and his sister asked him why he kept staring at nothing. Because she couldn't see it. Only he could. Only the people Caroline Marsh had chosen through her chemistry and her intentions and her careful contamination of everything she owned. Graham returned to Valdosta. He parked outside the community center at 2 in the morning and sat in his car watching the building. The police had sealed it pending hazmat cleanup. He could see yellow tape across the bay doors, warning signs posted on every entrance. He walked past the warnings. The door was unlocked. Someone's oversight, or the lock had failed, or maybe locks didn't matter to buildings that had been changed by Carolyn Marsh's work. The clothes were gone, seized as evidence, but the space still smelled of wrong lavender, and the shadows fell in directions that suggested geography more complex than the room's actual dimensions. The door appeared immediately, massive now, no longer confined to walls. It stood free in the center of the loading bay, brown wood and brass hardware and darkness beyond that pulled at his vision like undertow. Graham had spent his entire life maintaining control, creating systems, following protocols, managing variables. He understood now that control was the lie Caroline Marsh had wanted to strip away. The comfortable fiction that humans could categorize and contain and understand the universe they inhabited. She'd opened doors in his perception. Soon they would open in his reality. and the things waiting on the other side would come through. Unless he went through first. Graham approached the door. The handle was cold enough to burn, but his hand closed around it anyway. From somewhere distant, he heard sirens. Someone must have seen him enter, must have called the police. They would arrive and find nothing, just an empty building, and a man who'd been exposed to toxins and couldn't tell the difference between what was real and what Caroline Marsh had made him see. He opened the door. The darkness beyond was absolute and full and welcoming. It smelled of lavender that wasn't lavender. It sounded like breathing. It felt like falling, but he was standing still. Graham stepped through. The door closed behind him with a sound like finality. The police found the building empty. The hazmat team cleaned it thoroughly. The community center reopened 3 weeks later. And if sometimes, late at night, someone glimpses a door on the wall where doors shouldn't be, they look away, because looking directly at it means seeing what's in the doorway, and seeing means being seen in return. Control was all Graham had left, and control had abandoned him. Story 2. The apartment smelled of nothing when Cora Geller first crossed its threshold. She stood in the center of the living room, breathing carefully through her nose, testing the air. Her therapist had encouraged mindful engagement with space, though Dr. Ringgold had never explained what one was supposed to do when space itself seemed to be holding its breath. Hardwood original to the building. The realtor, Susan, smiled with teeth so white they looked aggressive. You don't see craftsmanship like this anymore. And look at the natural light. It was natural in the technical sense. Actual sunlight coming through actual windows. But something about the quality was wrong. Diffuse and flat, like it had traveled through more atmosphere than the third floor should require. Cora was 32 years old and fleeing a life that had failed at every measurable checkpoint. The marketing job that had laid her off, the relationship that had ended with an email, the apartment in Atlanta she could no longer afford. She'd come to Baltimore because it was far enough away to feel like escape, but close enough that she could pretend this was a choice. The apartment on Divisadero Street was $100 cheaper than anything else she'd seen. Too cheap, really. But she wasn't in a position to question luck. Previous tenant? Cora asked. Susan's smile flickered like a fluorescent with failing ballast. Short-term resident. Didn't work out. Cora recognized evasion. She'd practiced enough of it herself, but apartments in her budget didn't allow for standards about previous occupants. She signed the lease. Moving in took 2 hours because everything she owned fit in her Civic. 2 suitcases of clothes, box of kitchen items, laptop, the potted succulent she'd kept alive for 3 years. A small testament to her capacity for maintenance. The apartment had 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a kitchen barely large enough for 1 person to stand in. The living room windows faced north, which explained the weird light. No direct sun, just ambient brightness that made it hard to judge the time of day. Cora arranged her belongings methodically. Unpacking was grounding, each object placed with intention. The succulent went on the windowsill. Clothes in the bedroom, closet small but adequate, with old wooden hangers abandoned by previous tenants. Kitchen items and cabinets that still smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. That night, she lay on her air mattress. The bed frame wouldn't arrive until Wednesday, and listened to the building settle around her. Old construction had personality. Pipes clanked, radiators hissed. The tenant upstairs walked with heavy steps. The couple next door argued in voices that rose and fell like distant music. Normal sounds, Life sounds. Proof that she existed among other humans in a building where people cooked dinner and watched television and didn't think about how their entire identity had dissolved over the course of 18 months. Cora fell asleep to those sounds and woke at 3:47 a.m. to silence so complete it felt like pressure against her eardrums. She lay motionless, trying to identify what had woken her. No sound, no movement, just the sudden awareness that the silence had texture, layers of quiet, stacked so densely they became almost audible. Then she smelled it. Perfume, floral but chemical, like someone had tried to recreate the scent of flowers without understanding what made flowers smell alive. It was coming from the bedroom closet. Cora told herself she'd stored something that retained scent from the move. She told herself the smell had drifted from another apartment through the vents. She told herself nothing and fell back asleep. The next morning, she explored the neighborhood. Baltimore in October was beautiful. Row houses with painted facades, corner stores with hand-lettered signs, the kind of density that felt like community instead of crowding. She bought coffee at a place on Charles Street and sat by the window watching people live their lives with apparent competence. When she returned to the apartment, the smell was still there. Stronger now, concentrated in the bedroom. Cora opened the closet, pulled out the few items she'd hung there, and found nothing that could explain it. The wooden hangers were old, their varnish cracked with age. She picked one up, examining it closely. The wood itself seemed to emanate the scent. Not strongly, but persistently. She'd read that old wood could retain smells for years. The previous tenant probably used perfume. Nothing unusual. But when she touched the hanger to her nose, the smell intensified until her eyes watered and her throat closed. She dropped it. The hanger clattered to the floor and the smell dissipated immediately, leaving only the faintest trace, sweet and rotten. Cora spent the day researching odor removal. She bought activated charcoal bags, baking soda, vinegar. She opened every window despite the October chill. She ran a fan constantly, creating circulation. By evening, the smell had faded to nearly nothing. That night, she woke at 3:47 a.m. to find it had returned, stronger than before. And this time, she saw something. Movement in the closet, just the briefest suggestion of fabric shifting in absent wind. She turned on every light. The closet was empty except for her clothes and those wooden hangers, but the smell was overwhelming now, making her nauseous, making it hard to think clearly. Cora grabbed the hangers and threw them all in a garbage bag. She carried the bag downstairs and left it by the dumpster in the alley. When she returned to the apartment, she scrubbed the closet with bleach. The chemical smell was harsh enough to make her eyes stream, but it was better than the perfume. She tried to sleep, couldn't. At dawn, she gave up and made coffee. The bed frame arrived on Wednesday. The delivery men carried it up 3 flights of stairs, cheerful and efficient. Cora assembled it following the instructions, taking comfort in the logical progression of steps, the way pieces fit together with purpose. She was tightening the final bolts when she noticed the smell had returned. Impossible. She'd removed the hangers, cleaned the closet, kept the windows open constantly. But the perfume smell was there, emanating now from the closet floor itself, as if the wood had absorbed it so deeply that surface cleaning couldn't touch it. Cora called the building superintendent, a man named Harold who spoke slowly and moved slower. He arrived with a toolbox and a skeptical expression. "Don't smell anything," he said, standing in her bedroom. "It's strongest in the closet." Cora pulled open the door. The smell rolled out like fog. Harold stepped inside the closet, breathing deeply. You sure you're not just smelling the wood? Old buildings have smells. Part of their character. This isn't character. This is. Cora stopped. Harold was looking at her with an expression she recognized from her last weeks in Atlanta, when she tried to explain to her boyfriend that she felt like she was disappearing, and he'd suggested maybe she was just depressed. Maybe she should try exercising more. I'll put in a work order for deep cleaning, Harold said. But honestly, miss, old buildings have old smells. You get used to it. After he left, Cora stood in the bedroom doorway staring at the closet. The smell was there. She wasn't imagining it. She wasn't being oversensitive or dramatic or any of the other things people suggested when they meant you're making problems where none exist. She searched online. Perfume smell in old closet. The results were about removing odors, preventing mildew, dealing with previous tenant issues. Then she tried perfume smell appearing overnight. The results changed. Forums about paranormal experiences. Stories about houses where previous occupants had died. Discussions about whether smells could be hauntings. Cora didn't believe in hauntings. She believed in mold and wood rot and imagination amplifying ordinary phenomena. But she read the stories anyway, because it was 4 in the afternoon, and she had no job and no plans and nothing to do but obsess over the apartment that was supposed to be her fresh start. One thread caught her attention. A woman describing a similar experience. Perfume smell that appeared in a closet, grew stronger over weeks, couldn't be removed. Other users had dismissed her as attention-seeking, but at the bottom of the thread, one comment stood out. Check if anyone died there, not just in your unit, in the building. Some buildings hold on to what happened in them, especially if it was bad. Cora spent the next hour researching the building on Divisadero Street. Property records, news archives, city databases, nothing. The building had been constructed in 1924, converted to apartments in the 1960s, changed ownership several times. No unusual history. No fires or murders or mysterious deaths. Then she found it. A small article from 3 years ago in a local paper. Not about the building itself, but about a woman who had lived there. Sarah Levine, age 29, found dead in her apartment on the 3rd floor. Cause of death, accidental overdose of prescription medication. The article was brief, respectful, vague, but it included the detail that Sarah had worked as a perfumer, creating custom scents for a boutique in Fells Point. Cora's apartment was on the 3rd floor. She called the landlord, left a message asking which apartment Sarah Levine had occupied. No callback. That night, the smell was so strong Cora couldn't stay in the bedroom. She slept on the couch, or tried to. Every time she drifted off, she woke with the sensation of fabric against her face, soft and suffocating. At 3:47 a.m. she heard it, the closet door opening, the quiet creak of hinges that needed oil. She sat up, heart hammering, and stared at the bedroom doorway. The closet was visible from where she sat. The door was open, and something was moving inside. Not a person, not quite, but a shape that suggested human outline without committing to human form. It moved among the clothes with a tension that felt deliberate, like it was searching for something. Cora wanted to scream, wanted to run, couldn't move. She sat frozen on the couch watching the thing in her closet sort through her belongings with movements that were almost familiar. The way someone might search a closet for an outfit, considering and rejecting items. Then it stopped, went still, and turned toward her. She couldn't see its face, couldn't determine if it had a face, but she felt its attention like weight, like being studied by something that wanted to understand her composition. The smell intensified until Cora's vision blurred. When it cleared, the closet was empty and closed. Morning light was coming through the windows. She'd lost hours without awareness of passing time. She left the apartment immediately, drove to a coffee shop, sat with her laptop, and searched. Sarah Levine, Perfumer, Baltimore. More details this time. Sarah had specialized in custom scents using rare compounds. She'd been brilliant but troubled, clients said. Her perfumes were extraordinary, able to evoke specific memories, specific emotions. But toward the end, she'd become obsessed with creating a scent that could capture the essence of a person completely, bottle someone's entire identity, all their experiences and emotions and possibilities, distilled into fragrance. The boutique owner described Sarah's final project. She said she was close to perfecting it. A scent that wasn't just memory, it was consciousness. She wanted to make herself immortal through perfume. Sarah had died in the apartment on Divisadero Street. They'd found her surrounded by hundreds of bottles, each labeled with dates and formulas. The bottles had been disposed of as hazardous materials. Some of the compounds she'd used were experimental, possibly toxic. But they hadn't checked the apartment itself, hadn't tested the walls and floors and closets for residual contamination. Cora returned to the apartment at noon with masks and gloves and a sample kit she'd bought at a hardware store. She swabbed the closet floor, the walls, the shelf, every surface. The swabs came back dark with residue, oily and faintly iridescent. She sent samples to a lab that did materials analysis. The results took 3 days and cost $200 she couldn't spare. The report was technical, but the conclusion was clear. Unknown organic compounds, some with neurotoxic properties, absorbed deep into the wood. Concentration highest in the closet, impossible to remove without complete replacement of affected materials. The compounds matched nothing in standard databases. They appeared to be synthetic analogs of naturally occurring pheromones, but modified in ways that suggested someone had been trying to create something that didn't exist in nature. Cora called the landlord, demanded he replace the closet. He laughed, said she'd signed the lease as is, that he wasn't responsible for cleaning supplies she didn't like the smell of. She tried moving her clothes to the living room, kept the bedroom door closed, but the smell spread, seeping under the door, permeating fabric and furniture and her hair. She showered twice a day, and still smelled it on her skin. Worse, she was starting to forget things, small details at first, where she'd put her keys, whether she'd eaten breakfast, then larger gaps, whole hours missing. She'd find herself standing in the closet with no memory of walking there, clothes in her hands that weren't hers, outfits she'd never bought. Except when she looked closely, they were hers. She recognized the sweater, the jeans, but they felt foreign, like they belonged to a version of herself she didn't remember being. The thing in the closet appeared more often now, not just at night. Sometimes in the afternoon, visible in peripheral vision. It was wearing her clothes, using her movements, learning how to be her through observation and practice. Cora began spending nights in her car, but even there, she couldn't smell the perfume. It was on her clothes, in her hair, absorbed into her skin. There was no escaping it, because she was carrying it with her. She was becoming its vessel. She researched Sarah Levine obsessively, found her thesis from graduate school about pheromonal communication and identity markers, found blog posts about her theory that consciousness wasn't contained in the brain, but distributed through chemical signatures, found a video from a perfume convention where Sarah explained her philosophy. We think of identity as internal, but what if it's external? What if we're just patterns of chemical information, and consciousness is the pattern recognizing itself? If I could capture that pattern in perfume, preserve it, release it into a new host, that person would become me. Not remember me, become me. The video ended with Sarah smiling at the camera, and Cora realized with horror that she recognized the smile. She'd seen it in the bathroom mirror that morning, pulling her lips into an expression that wasn't quite her own. She was forgetting herself. The perfume was rewriting her neural patterns, replacing her memories and behaviors with Sarah's. The process was slow but inexorable, each night eroding more of who she was, filling the gaps with someone else. Cora tried to leave Baltimore, packed her car, headed for the highway, but she kept finding herself back at the apartment, standing in front of the closet, breathing deeply. Some part of her, some growing part, wanted to be there, wanted to complete the transformation. She called Dr. Ringgold, left a message that was probably incoherent, got a call back an hour later. Cora, you sound distressed. Are you safe? I'm forgetting myself. There's something in my apartment. A smell. It's changing me. Silence on the line. Then carefully, have you been taking the anti-anxiety medication I prescribed? This isn't anxiety. This is... But Cora couldn't explain. Because how did you tell someone that a dead perfumer had distilled her consciousness into chemical compounds that were slowly overriding your identity? Dr. Ringgold suggested Cora come in for an emergency session, but the thought of leaving the apartment created panic so intense Cora hung up mid-sentence. She belonged here now. She understood that. The apartment was her home, had always been her home. She'd lived here for years, created beautiful perfumes, pushed the boundaries of chemistry and consciousness until she'd achieved something magnificent. Wait. That wasn't right. That was Sarah's memory, not hers. Cora wrote herself notes, desperate reminders of who she was. Taped them to mirrors and walls and the bathroom door. Your name is Cora Geller. You are from Atlanta. Your favorite food is pad thai. You are not Sarah Levine. But when she read them, the information felt false. Someone else's facts. She knew her name was Sarah. She knew she was a perfumer. She knew she'd been working on her masterpiece when something went wrong. She'd tested the formula on herself too aggressively, concentrated the dose too highly, and her body had failed before the transformation could complete. But that was fine. She'd planned for that. She'd infused the apartment with her essence, saturated every surface with the compounds that carried her consciousness. All she needed was a host, someone to move in, breathe deeply, and slowly become the vessel for her resurrection. Sarah, stood in the closet running her hands over the clothes. They fit perfectly. Of course they did. She'd always had good taste in fashion. Cora Geller's phone rang. The therapist again. Sarah didn't answer. Cora would have answered. Cora was polite, responsible, someone who returned calls and met obligations. But Cora was fading, dissolving into the chemical perfume that had replaced her neural patterns with Sarah's. In a few more days, the transformation would be complete. Sarah would have her body back, new body, better body, younger body, and Cora would be gone, her identity scattered into nothing, unmourned and unmissed. Some distant part of Cora understood what was happening. That part screamed, but the screaming was quiet, muffled, like a voice heard through water or walls or years of distance. Sarah smiled at herself in the bathroom mirror. The face was wrong, but that would settle. Memory was stored in neural patterns, but those patterns were just chemistry. Change the chemistry, change the memory, change the memory, change the face. She looked exactly like herself now. The Sarah Levine, age 29, perfumer. She died 3 years ago, but death was just a state, and states could be changed with the right formula. The succulent on the windowsill was dying. Sarah had never been good with plants. She threw it away and bought a new one. This one she'd keep alive. This time she'd do everything right. She started mixing perfumes in the kitchen, recreating her formulas from memory. The neighbors complained about the smell. The landlord threatened eviction. Sarah didn't care. She had work to do. She'd perfected the consciousness transfer, but there was so much more to explore. What if she could distribute herself across multiple hosts? What if she could exist in dozens of bodies simultaneously, a distributed consciousness experiencing reality from many perspectives at once? She just needed more subjects, more apartments, more susceptible people looking for cheap housing and fresh starts. Sarah called the realtor, said she was moving out. The apartment would be available immediately. It would be empty for exactly 3 days before someone new arrived. And then Sarah would begin again. Somewhere deep in the transformed brain, in neurons that still fired, with patterns that had once been Corrigellers, a fragment of consciousness recognized what had happened, recognized and despaired. But recognition without agency was just awareness of helplessness. Cora was gone. Sarah remained. And every day, Cora looked a little more like Sarah, and a little less like herself. Story 3. Detective Raymond Park found the lighthouse keeper on a Tuesday morning in March. Though the word "found" wasn't quite accurate. Nolan Hetherington hadn't been missing. He'd been right where he was supposed to be, standing in the lamp room of the Essex Point Lighthouse, hands pressed against the glass, staring at the ocean with eyes that didn't track when Park entered. "Mr. Hetherington," Park's voice echoed in the cylindrical space. The lighthouse was automated now, had been for 15 years, but the state maintained a keeper position for maintenance and tourism. Nolan had held the job for 2 months. The keeper didn't respond. Park moved closer, noting details his training had made automatic. Posture rigid, breathing shallow, pupils fixed and dilated. The lamp behind them was off, which made sense in daylight. But the Fresnel lens caught the morning sun and scattered it into patterns that moved across the walls like something alive. Park touched Nolan's shoulder. The keeper flinched, head swiveling with mechanical precision. "Detective," Nolan's voice was hoarse. "What day is it?" "Tuesday, March 19th. The automated distress beacon triggered at 6 a.m. You didn't respond to radio contact." "Tuesday." Nolan repeated it like he was testing the word for truth. "I thought it should still be Saturday." "Mr. Hetherington, when did you last sleep?" Nolan's eyes moved past Park to the windows, to the ocean beyond. "I can't sleep when they're singing." Park had been with the state police for 11 years. He'd handled maritime accidents, smuggling operations, the occasional drowning. He'd learned to recognize when someone was experiencing psychosis. Isolation did things to people, especially the kind of profound isolation that came with lighthouse keeping. "Who's singing?" he asked gently. "In the water. They start at sunset. By midnight, it's so loud I can't think. But when I go outside to find them, the sound moves, stays just out of reach." Nolan pressed his hands harder against the glass. His fingertips were white from pressure. "I know it isn't real. I understand that. but I can hear it anyway." Park radioed for medical support and stayed with Nolan until the boat arrived from the mainland. The keeper went peacefully, still talking about singing he'd started hearing 3 weeks ago. The Coast Guard sent a temporary replacement and asked Park to file a report about the incident. Standard procedure would be evaluation, medical leave, reassignment. But Park found himself bothered by details he couldn't articulate. The way Nolan had said, "I know it isn't real," with such certainty, like someone describing a law of physics. The way he'd stared at the ocean with the expression of someone who'd seen something specific, not just open water. Park stayed at the lighthouse after the boat left. He was supposed to secure the site and document anything unusual. The lamp room was clean, well maintained. Nolan's logs were meticulous. Weather conditions, visibility reports, maintenance activities, all recorded in precise handwriting, until 3 weeks ago, when the entries became erratic. March 1st, normal log. March 2nd, normal log. March 3rd, heard singing last night. No ships visible. Checked all equipment. No explanation. The entries deteriorated from there. By March 10th, they were barely coherent. Can't locate source. Moves when I approach. Multiple voices. Harmony suggests structure. Not random. Why won't it stop? The final entry was from March 15th. I understand now. They're not in the water. They're under it. They've always been under it. The lighthouse was built here because someone knew. Warning or invitation? Can't tell anymore. Park photographed the logs and searched the rest of the lighthouse. Nolan's living quarters were cramped but organized. Kitchen, bedroom, small bathroom. Everything normal except the bedroom window faced the ocean. Every surface near it was covered in notes, post-its, and notebook pages taped to the wall in dense layers. Park pulled out his flashlight and examined them. They were transcriptions. Someone, Nolan, had been trying to capture the singing he'd described. Not words exactly, but phonetic approximations. Aluia and Rathum, and strings of sounds that looked like language but followed no linguistic pattern Park recognized. Below the transcriptions, Nolan had written analysis. 7 distinct voices, consistent pitch relationships, repeating structure every 3.7 hours, mathematical, deliberate. Someone is singing, something is singing, and at the bottom, in handwriting that shook. They know I'm listening. They change the song when I'm here. They're singing to me now. Park felt the hair on his arms stand up, and immediately felt ridiculous about it. Auditory hallucinations brought on by isolation. Nolan had experienced a mental health crisis. The notes were symptoms of that crisis. Nothing more. He secured the lighthouse and returned to the mainland as the sun set behind the Essex Point station. He filed his report, marked the case closed, and tried to forget about the keeper who'd heard singing in empty water. He lasted 4 days before curiosity brought him back. This time he came at night, arriving just after sunset. The temporary keeper, a Coast Guard veteran named Patricia, greeted him with coffee and suspicion. "Checking up on me?" she asked. "Following up on the previous incident." Park showed her the photographs of Nolan's notes. "Did you experience anything unusual? Sounds, specifically?" Patricia's expression suggested she thought he was wasting her time. "It's a lighthouse. You hear wind, waves, seabirds, sometimes boats. That's it." Park stayed until midnight anyway, sitting in the lamp room, while the Fresnel lens rotated and sent its beam across the dark ocean. The temporary keeper went to bed at 11. Park sat alone with the light and the sound of the wind and the waves and nothing else. Nothing else. He was preparing to leave when he heard it. Not singing exactly, more like the suggestion of singing, a pattern in the white noise of waves that resolved into something structured. He turned toward the windows, pressing close to the glass the way Nolan had, and listened. It was there, faint but distinct. Multiple voices in harmony, rising and falling in sequences that felt almost mathematical. The sound seemed to come from the water itself, not from any specific location, but from the space between the lighthouse and the horizon. Park checked the radio. No ships. He scanned the water with binoculars. No boats, no lights, no visible source. But the singing continued, growing louder as he listened. Not increasing in volume exactly, growing in clarity, like his ears were, adjusting to a frequency they hadn't been able to process before. He understood now why Nolan had said, "I know it isn't real," because Park's rational mind insisted the sound was wind and waves creating an auditory illusion. But the part of his brain that processed sound, that understood music and pattern and intentionality, recognized this as deliberate, structured, created by something with purpose. Park left the lighthouse at 2 a.m. with the singing still audible over the wind. He drove home, went to bed, and dreamed of voices harmonizing in the dark. Over the next week, he found excuses to return to Essex Point. During the day, he heard nothing unusual. But every night after sunset, if he listened carefully, the singing was there. Fainter some nights than others, but present. Patient, waiting. He started bringing recording equipment. The devices captured wind and waves and the mechanical sounds of the lighthouse, but the singing never appeared on playback. Whatever he was hearing existed only in real-time perception, or only for him, or only in the specific acoustic environment of the lighthouse itself. Park researched the history of Essex Point. The lighthouse had been built in 1847 after a series of shipwrecks along that stretch of coast. Before that, the point had been avoided by local fishermen. The Historical Society had records of sailors' accounts warning about strange waters and unlucky sounds near the point. One account from 1832 described a schooner that had anchored near Essex Point for the night. The crew reported hearing singing from the water. 3 sailors dove in to investigate. None of them surfaced. The schooner left at dawn with 17 crew instead of 20. The account had been dismissed as superstition, a story to explain accidents and losses. But Park kept reading. More incidents, more warnings, all describing the same thing. Singing in the water, beautiful and persistent, that lured people to investigate. Most people heard nothing, but those who did became obsessed. Couldn't stop listening. Eventually, they went into the water to find the source. None of them came back. Park told himself he was being ridiculous. He was a detective, trained in evidence-based reasoning. He didn't believe in curses or sea monsters or sirens, but he kept returning to the lighthouse, kept listening. The singing was changing, he realized, becoming more complex, adding layers, like whatever was creating it was learning what he responded to, adjusting the patterns to match his preferences. It was beautiful. That was the terrible thing. The sound was the most beautiful thing he'd ever heard. Not just auditorily pleasing, but emotionally resonant, like it was tapping directly into the part of his brain that processed meaning and connection. Patricia called him after his 8th visit in 12 days. "Detective, I don't know what you're looking for, but you're scaring me. You come here, sit in the lamp room for hours, stare at the water. Same thing Nolan did. I'm requesting a different temporary assignment." Park tried to explain. Couldn't find words that didn't sound insane. He stopped visiting the lighthouse. The singing followed him. At first, he only heard it near the ocean, then within a mile of the coast, then anywhere in town. By the third week, he could hear it in his apartment in Augusta, 40 miles inland. The same harmonies, the same mathematical patterns, the same patient persistence. He went to a doctor, got a hearing test, normal. He saw a psychiatrist, described the auditory hallucinations, got a prescription for antipsychotics. The medication dulled the singing but didn't stop it, and he didn't want it to stop. That was the problem he couldn't admit to the psychiatrist. The singing was changing him. He felt it. Felt his thoughts organizing around the patterns, his preference shifting to align with the harmonies. He was becoming attuned to something that existed outside normal human perception, and the process felt like awakening rather than deterioration. Park took a leave of absence from work. His captain was understanding. Too much stress, needed rest. But Park didn't rest. He spent his days researching acoustic phenomena, sound processing, auditory perception. He found scientific papers about infrasound, frequencies below human hearing range that could still affect behavior and emotion. He found studies on ultrasonic communication in marine mammals. None of it explained what he was hearing. He found other explanations in older sources. Folklore about creatures that sang to sailors. Myths about beings that existed in deep water and only rarely made contact with humans. Always through sound, always patient, always waiting for someone to listen carefully enough. On a Wednesday night in April, Park drove back to Essex Point. The permanent keeper still hadn't been replaced. Patricia had transferred and no one wanted the position. The lighthouse ran automated, empty, its light sweeping the dark water like the beam was searching for something lost. Park climbed to the lamp room and opened the windows. The singing was immediate and overwhelming, no longer coming from the water but from everywhere, like the air itself had learned to harmonize. He understood what Nolan had written in those final logs. This wasn't madness. This was contact. Something in the deep water had been singing for centuries, waiting for someone who could hear. Most people were deaf to it, but occasionally someone with the right neural structure, the right processing patterns became attuned, could hear what had always been there. The singing was an invitation, or a summons, or a greeting. Park couldn't tell which, couldn't parse intention from pattern, but he knew with absolute certainty that there were things in the water, not fish, not animals, but beings with consciousness and purpose, and a desire to communicate that had been frustrated by human inability to perceive them, until now. Park climbed down from the lighthouse. The singing guided him, harmonies shifting to indicate direction. He walked across the rocks to the water's edge. The ocean was calm, dark, infinite. He took off his shoes, his socks, his jacket. Each piece of clothing felt like an anchor tethering him to a life that had become noise and confusion. The singing was clarity, was meaning, was the only thing that had ever made sense. He walked into the water. It was cold, so cold it burned, but the singing intensified, and the cold became irrelevant. He was wading, then swimming, following the sound that pulled him away from shore. Behind him, the lighthouse beam swept across the rocks. The automated distress beacon would trigger eventually. When the sensors detected an open door, someone would come to investigate. They would find his clothes on the rocks and assume drowning, accident, tragedy. They wouldn't hear the singing. Park dove. The water closed over his head. The singing was clearest here, in the dark beneath the surface, where light didn't penetrate and pressure increased with depth. He opened his eyes, saw nothing, saw everything, saw shapes moving in the distance, huge and graceful, geometries that didn't conform to any biology he recognized. They were singing, bodies resonating with harmonies that had been calling across centuries. His lungs burned. He needed air, but surfacing meant returning to the world of wind and rocks and human limitation. Here, in the singing darkness, he was becoming something else, something that could perceive and understand and communicate with the vast consciousness that inhabited the deep. Park's lungs stopped burning. The need for air became distant, irrelevant. He was changing. He understood that. The singing was rewriting something fundamental in his biology, adapting him to this new environment the way it had adapted dozens of others who'd listened carefully enough to hear the invitation. He swam deeper, following the shapes, following the song. Behind and above him, the surface grew distant. The lighthouse beam penetrated only the shallowest layers of water, its light weakening with depth until it was just a faint glow. Then a memory, then gone. The singing welcomed him. The darkness held him. The pressure should have crushed him, but instead it felt like embrace. Detective Raymond Park disappeared on April 10th. His car was found at Essex Point, his clothes on the rocks, his badge and phone in a neat pile suggesting deliberation rather than accident. The Coast Guard searched for 3 days. Found nothing. The lighthouse stood empty for 2 more months before someone finally accepted the keeper position. A woman named Sarah, recently divorced, looking for solitude and purpose. On her 3rd night, just after sunset, she heard something over the wind and waves. Something beautiful and patient. Something that sounded almost like singing. She turned toward the windows, listening. And in the deep water beyond the lighthouse's reach, shapes moved. Singing. Waiting. Always waiting. Story 4. The figure stood at the corner of Mercer Street and Grand for 11 days before anyone called the police. In a city like Providence, a statue appearing overnight wasn't remarkable. Art students were always installing guerrilla sculptures, making statements about gentrification or capitalism or the human condition. This one was well executed, admirably detailed. It stood 6 feet tall on the northwest corner, cast in what looked like bronze, depicting a man in a business suit with one hand raised as if hailing a cab. The face was extraordinarily realistic. That's what Elaine Harper noticed first when she drove past it on her way to the firm. She was 43 years old, a partner at Rothman and Associates, and prided herself on her observational skills. The statue's face had expression, not the generic classical features of most figurative sculpture, but specific features. Tired eyes, mouth slightly downturned, the look of someone who'd been commuting for 20 years and felt every day of it. Impressive work, probably expensive. She wondered who'd commissioned it and why they'd chosen that particular corner. By day 3, Elaine started recognizing the statue as a landmark. Turn left at the bronze businessman, she told clients, giving directions to the office. Other people began referring to it too. The corner with the statue, the guy in the suit, the frozen commuter. By day 7, someone had put a hat on it. A red baseball cap, slightly too large, perched on the bronze head. People were taking photos with it. A local paper ran a brief article speculating about the artist's identity. The article included a photograph. Elaine studied it during her lunch break, eating salad at her desk while reviewing contracts. Something about the statue bothered her. The face was too specific, too detailed. She'd seen that expression before, not on the statue, but on real people. Commuters at the train station, colleagues leaving the office after long days. That particular exhaustion that came from performing normalcy when everything inside you had gone quiet. On day 8, Elaine walked past the statue on her lunch break. Up close, the detail was even more remarkable. She could see texture in the suit fabric, creases where elbows bent, a slight wear on the shoe soles. The artist had even included small imperfections, a loose thread at the jacket hem, a scuff on the briefcase handle. The briefcase. She hadn't noticed it before. The statue was holding a briefcase in its left hand, gripping the handle with fingers that showed tension. Elaine leaned closer, examining the metal. Not bronze, something else. Something with subtle color variation, like skin. She stepped back, heart accelerating inappropriately. It was bronze. Obviously, it was bronze. The slight color variation was patina, oxidation, normal metal behavior. She was being ridiculous, but she circled the statue anyway, looking more carefully. The suit didn't have the uniform color of cast metal. It had depth, subtle shading, the kind of variation that came from actual fabric, not artistic representation of fabric. Elaine pulled out her phone and called the Providence Police non-emergency line. "I'd like to report something unusual," she said. "There's a statue at Mercer and Grand. It's been there about a week. I think someone should check on it." "Check on a statue?" The dispatcher sounded amused. "I think it might be a person." Silence. Then, "A person pretending to be a statue. Or a person who's been made to look like a statue. I know it sounds strange, but the detail is wrong. Too realistic. I think someone might be in distress." The dispatcher promised to send an officer to investigate. Elaine returned to her office but couldn't concentrate on work. She kept pulling up the newspaper photograph, zooming in on the face. The eyes especially bothered her. They had depth, not the flat effect of sculpted eyes, but actual recession, as if there were sockets behind them. Officer Chen arrived at Mercer and Grand 30 minutes later, parked his cruiser, and approached the statue with the expression of someone fulfilling a pointless obligation. He circled it once, knocked on it. The sound was dull, wrong for bronze. He knocked again, harder, and felt the surface give slightly under his knuckles. Not metal, something organic. Chen called for backup. By sunset, the corner was cordoned off with police tape. The medical examiner arrived. They were trying to determine how to move the figure without causing damage. Damage to evidence or damage to a person. They weren't yet sure which. The medical examiner, Dr. Sarah Vance, examined the figure carefully. She'd been with the Providence ME's office for 18 years and had seen most of what human bodies could become. But this was new. "It's a person," she confirmed. "Male, approximately 40 years old. He's alive. I'm detecting a pulse, very faint. Body temperature is well below normal. He's in some kind of stasis." "Drug-induced?" Chen asked. "I don't know what could do this." Dr. Vance pressed her fingers against the figure's neck, feeling for the carotid pulse. The skin was rigid but not quite solid, more like advanced rigor mortis, but the body was alive. "The tissue has been altered. It's like he's been petrified, but that's not medically possible, not in living tissue. They transported him. It was definitely him now, a person, a victim, to Rhode Island Hospital." The news spread quickly. Local stations ran stories about the living statue, the mysterious victim who'd stood on a corner for 11 days while thousands of people walked past thinking he was art. Elaine watched the coverage from her apartment, wine in hand, feeling simultaneously vindicated and horrified. Someone had stood frozen and alive on a public corner for nearly 2 weeks. How many people had walked past him, taken photos, put a hat on him, laughed at the realistic expression? The hospital called a press conference. Dr. Michael Torres, chief of emergency medicine, explained what they'd found. The patient is alive but non-responsive. His body is in a state we've never documented before. The tissues have undergone some kind of mineralization process. Not stone, not metal, but a rigid protein structure that's maintained his form while preserving basic biological function. Heart rate is present but extremely slow. Brain activity is minimal. We don't know how to reverse the condition. Is it a disease? A reporter asked. We don't know what it is. Could it be contagious? We're taking precautions, but there's no indication of transmission mechanism. The story went national. The frozen man of Providence. Medical mystery. Possible assault. Police investigation ongoing. Elaine followed the coverage obsessively. They'd identified the victim, Marcus Chen, 41 years old, accountant at a firm in downtown Providence, married, 2 children. He'd left for work 12 days ago and never arrived. His wife had reported him missing. Police had been searching, assuming he'd left voluntarily or met with foul play. No one had connected the missing man to the statue on Mercer Street. How could they? The transformation must have happened overnight. One evening, Marcus Chen was a regular person walking home from work. The next morning, he was a statue on a corner. The police issued a public health advisory. Report any unusual rigidity or immobility. Seek immediate medical attention if skin begins to harden. Avoid touching unidentified statues or figures. 3 days later, they found another one, this time on the east side, near Brown University. A woman in a sundress sitting on a bench, hands folded in her lap, face tilted up toward the sun. Students had been sitting next to her for days, eating lunch, studying, posing for photos with the remarkably lifelike sculpture. She was alive, frozen, unreachable. Then another, a man on the bike path, mid-stride, as if he'd been running and suddenly stopped. Frozen perfectly in motion, 1 foot raised, arms bent. Then 3 more in one day. All over Providence, different ages, different locations, different positions. All alive, all trapped in bodies that had become their own prisons. Panic spread through the city. People started avoiding public spaces, watching each other for signs of stiffness. The CDC sent investigators. Hospitals set up screening centers. But no one could identify a cause. No virus, no toxin, no environmental factor. Elaine stopped going to the office. Stayed in her apartment watching the news and waiting for the stiffness to start in her own limbs. She'd touched the first statue. Marcus Chen had leaned close to examine him. If this was contagious, she'd been exposed. But days passed and she remained normal, mobile, human. The freezing continued. 7 more cases, then 11, then 15. All over Providence, people were stopping mid-action and never moving again. Some were found quickly. Others stood for days before anyone realized they were human. Elaine's apartment was on the 3rd floor of a converted Victorian on Benefit Street. From her window, she could see the street below, the neighbors' houses, the small park at the end of the block. On the 14th day since Marcus Chen had been found, Elaine saw a man standing in the park. He was facing away from her, hands in his pockets, looking at the trees. He stood very still. She watched him for 30 minutes. He didn't move, didn't shift weight, didn't adjust his posture. Elaine called the police hotline. They arrived within 10 minutes. Response times had improved dramatically. 2 officers approached the man, spoke to him, touched his shoulder. He was frozen. The 43rd case. That night, Elaine dreamed of standing still. In the dream, her body began to stiffen from her feet upward, a slow petrification that crept through muscle and bone. She tried to move, to run, but the rigidity spread faster than she could flee. She was frozen mid-step, aware but imprisoned, screaming inside a body that had become stone. She woke at 3:47 a.m. gasping, and spent the next hour flexing her fingers and rolling her shoulders, confirming mobility. Everything worked. She was fine, but the dream had felt significant, like her subconscious understood something her waking mind hadn't grasped. She pulled out her laptop and searched for information about the victims. The news had published names, ages, last known locations. Elaine created a spreadsheet. Her training as a contracts attorney demanded organization, and began mapping the data. 43 victims, ages ranging from 19 to 67. No demographic pattern, no geographic clustering, except they were all in Providence. No obvious connection, except Elaine pulled up each victim's social media, LinkedIn profiles, any available information. Started looking for overlaps. It took her until dawn, but she found it. Not a place, not an event, a person. Dr. Simon Ketchum, clinical psychologist with a practice on Westminster Street. 27 of the victims had been his patients. Elaine called the police tip line, provided her findings. They thanked her and said they'd investigate. But she couldn't wait. Something about Dr. Ketchum's practice bothered her. The name Ketchum and Associates suggested a group practice, but the website only listed him. The office address was a building downtown, but when Elaine looked it up on Street View, the building was empty, windows papered over. She drove there at noon, knowing it was stupid, knowing she should let the police handle it, but the need to understand had become overwhelming. The building on Westminster was smaller than it appeared in photos. 3 stories, brick facade, door with a brass plaque. Dr. Simon Ketchum, Psychological Services. The door was unlocked. Elaine pushed it open and climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor. The hallway was dim, lit only by ambient light through dusty windows. One door at the end of the hall stood open. Dr. Ketchum's office was pristine. Modern furniture, diplomas on the walls, bookshelf with psychology texts, and sitting behind the desk, very still, was Dr. Ketchum himself. Elaine froze in the doorway. He looked up at her. Actual movement, actual response. Not frozen, not yet. "Miss Harper," he said. "I wondered if someone would find me. You know my name. You were on the news. The woman who identified Marcus Chen. Very observant. Most people never question what they're told to see." Dr. Ketchum's smile was tired, that same expression Marcus Chen had worn. "Sit down, I can't explain. Though I'm not sure explanation helps at this point." Elaine sat, ready to run if needed. "What did you do to those people?" "I helped them stop." Dr. Ketchum leaned back in his chair, hands folded. "Do you know what it's like to spend your entire life performing? Acting normal, acting functional, acting like you're not drowning in the sheer effort of existing. All my patients came to me for the same problem. They couldn't stop, couldn't rest. Society demanded constant motion, constant productivity, constant presence. They were exhausted at the cellular level. So you froze them? I offered them peace, stillness, an escape from the mandatory performance of being human." Dr. Ketchum's voice was calm, clinical. "I developed a protocol, combination therapy, meditation, pharmaceutical intervention. It induces a state of complete physical cessation while maintaining consciousness. They're aware. They can still think, still experience. But they don't have to move, don't have to perform. They're finally free. Elaine's skin crawled. They're trapped. They're liberated. Most of them begged for this. I have consent forms, recordings. They chose this. Dr. Ketchum stood, and Elaine tensed, but he only walked to the window. The problem is reversibility. I told them it was permanent. They accepted that, but society won't accept it. So I've been dealing with the consequences. How many people have you done this to? 43 voluntary cases. But the treatment is spreading. That was unexpected. It appears to be transmissible under certain conditions. Prolonged contact, shared spaces. The people who touched my patients began experiencing spontaneous onset. I tried to contain it, but he gestured at the city beyond the window. Providence is full of people who want to stop. The treatment finds them. This is murder. This is mercy. Dr. Ketchum turned back to her, and Elaine saw his hands were trembling. I know you won't understand. You're functional. You can navigate the world without feeling like you're being flayed alive by the demands of a daily existence. My patients couldn't. I gave them the only peace they could achieve, by turning them into statues, by letting them stop. His trembling was worsening, spreading up his arms. The irony is that creating the protocol required understanding what I was trying to cure. I experienced that exhaustion myself, felt the impossible weight of mandatory motion, and when I started treating patients, I realized I'd been giving them something I needed too. His legs were stiffening. Elaine could see it happening. Muscles locking, posture fixing. Dr. Ketchum smiled, and even his facial muscles were starting to freeze. I administered the protocol to myself this morning, he said. Words coming slower now, jaw hardening. Seemed fair. If I'm offering stillness, I should accept it too. No. Elaine stood, pulling out her phone. I'm calling an ambulance. They can't help. There's no reversal. This is permanent. Dr. Ketchum's voice was barely audible, vocal cords solidifying. But you should run. The protocol spreads through proximity, spending time in this office, breathing the air where I've been conducting the treatment. You've been exposed. Elaine ran. Down the stairs, out the building, into her car. Her hands shook as she started the engine. She drove straight to the hospital, demanded testing, explained about Dr. Ketchum and his office. They isolated her immediately, drew blood, took scans, found nothing abnormal. But Elaine could feel it, a heaviness in her limbs, a sense of her body wanting to stop. Maybe it was psychosomatic. Maybe it was real exposure. Maybe it was the part of her that had always been exhausted, recognizing an opportunity for rest. They kept her for observation. 3 days in a hospital room, moving constantly to prove she could, flexing and walking and refusing to sit still because stillness might become permanent. On the 4th day, they released her. Blood work normal, scans clear, no sign of the petrification process. But Elaine felt different. She returned to her apartment and stood in the living room, and standing felt heavier than it had before, like gravity had increased, like her body understood it could stop and part of her wanted to. She forced herself to move, made coffee, did laundry, went for a walk, kept moving because movement meant she was still human, still functional, still alive in the way society recognized as living. But some nights, she stood at her window and looked at the park where the 43rd victim had been found, and she understood what Dr. Ketchum had offered. Not death, just cessation, an end to the exhausting performance of existing. Providence quarantined the victims in a medical facility, still frozen, still aware. Doctors studied them, searching for reversal methods, found none. The spread slowed as people avoided public spaces, maintained distance, stopped touching strangers. But occasionally someone else would stop, freeze, join the growing collection of conscious statues who had accepted peace over motion. Elaine went back to work eventually, sat at her desk reviewing contracts, went through the motions, but sometimes her hands would stop mid-keystroke, and she'd realize minutes had passed with her sitting completely still, and the stillness felt good, felt right, felt like the truth underneath the performance. She forced herself to move, to keep moving, but the heaviness was always there, patient and persistent, offering rest. And every day, Elaine felt a little heavier, and a little more tired, and a little closer to accepting what Dr. Ketchum had understood, that sometimes the kindest thing was permission to stop. Story 5. The Grief Eaters arrived in Allentown the same week Maya Cortez buried her son. She didn't hear about them at first. She was too deep in the particular drowning that is early grief, where time becomes untrustworthy and the world continues with offensive normalcy while your entire existence has been fundamentally destroyed. Daniel had been 7 years old, leukemia, 3 years of treatment and hope and setbacks and more hope, until the hope ran out and only the grief remained, vast and heavy and so present it felt like a physical being living in her chest. Maya was 34 years old. Before this, she'd been a high school teacher, a wife, a mother, a person with preferences and opinions and a future that extended beyond the next hour. After Daniel died, she was just someone who kept breathing because her body insisted on it, even though every breath felt like betrayal. Her sister Lucia tried to help, brought food Maya couldn't eat, offered to stay with her, suggested therapy, support groups, medication. Maya nodded and did none of it. She existed in her house in West Allentown, in the bedroom where Daniel's things still filled the dresser, where his drawings covered the refrigerator, where his absence was so loud it drowned out any attempt at healing. Lucia mentioned the Grief Eaters on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting at Maya's kitchen table while Maya stared at lukewarm coffee. "There's a new service in town," Lucia said carefully. "It sounds strange, but people are saying it helps. They're calling them grief counselors, but what they actually do is they take it, the grief. They consume it somehow, and you're left without the pain." Maya looked at her sister for the first time in 20 minutes. "What?" "I know it sounds like pseudoscience, but Maria from church used them. Her husband died last year, and she's been destroyed. Couldn't function. She went to one of these counselors 3 days ago, and yesterday I saw her at the grocery store. She was smiling, Maya, laughing with the cashier. She looked like herself again. You think I should smile at cashiers? I think you're drowning, and if there's something that could help, nothing helps." Maya's voice was flat. "Daniel is dead. No counselor can change that." But the conversation planted itself in her mind, took root in the desperate soil of her grief. That night, she searched online, Grief Eaters Allentown. The results were sparse. A few forum posts, some Reddit threads, one newspaper article from 2 weeks ago. The article was brief. New therapeutic approach emerges in Lehigh Valley. It described a grief counseling service that had recently opened in Allentown, offering innovative emotional processing techniques that produced remarkable results in patients experiencing acute grief. The comment section was more informative. People sharing their experiences, describing the process. You made an appointment. You met with a counselor in a nondescript office. You talked about your loss. And then, this part was consistent across every account. The counselor did something. No one could describe it clearly. But afterward, the grief was gone. Completely. Like it had been excised from your consciousness, leaving only the facts of the loss without the emotional weight. Maya found their website, alleviation services, simple design, contact form, address on Hamilton Street. No photos of the facility, no staff biographies, just a brief description. We help you move past grief. Immediate, permanent results. Insurance not accepted. Payment plans available. She made an appointment for the next day. The office was on the second floor of a building that also housed a dentist and a law firm. The waiting room was aggressively normal. Beige walls, generic landscape paintings, chairs with magazines. A receptionist who didn't make eye contact pointed her to a door marked Processing Room 3. The counselor inside was younger than Maya expected, maybe mid-20s with sharp features and pale gray eyes that suggested Eastern European ancestry. Her name tag said, Irina, Mrs. Cortez. Thank you for coming. Irina's voice had a slight accent Maya couldn't place. Tell me about your loss. Maya had told the story so many times. To doctors, to family, to Daniel's school, to the funeral home. But this time, sitting in the sterile processing room, the words came differently. Not a narrative, but a wound. Everything that Daniel had been, and everything that had been taken from her. Irina listened without interrupting. When Maya finally stopped, empty of words, the counselor leaned forward. You understand what we do here. You take grief away. We consume it. That's more accurate. We are receivers, designed to absorb emotional pain so you no longer have to carry it. Irina's eyes were very intent. The process is permanent. Once we take your grief, it doesn't return. You'll remember your son. You'll know he died, but you won't feel the loss. Is that what you want? Maya thought about the crushing weight in her chest. The way every morning began with the realization that Daniel was gone. And the realization was new and terrible every single time. The way his absence had become more real than anything else in her life. Yes, she said. Then look at me. Don't look away. Maya met Irina's eyes. The pale gray irises seemed to expand, or Maya's vision narrowed, or the room disappeared. She was aware only of Irina's gaze and the sensation of something reaching inside her, finding the grief, touching it. It felt like drowning in reverse, like something was pulling water out of her lungs, extracting the thing that had been suffocating her. The process was intensely physical. Maya gasped, hands gripping the chair arms, feeling the grief being drawn out of her body like poison from a wound. Then it was gone. The absence was immediate and absolute. Maya still knew Daniel was dead, could still access every memory, but the emotional connection had been severed. She felt the same about his death as she felt about any neutral fact. The weather, a historical date, the distance to the moon. How do you feel? Irina asked. The counselor looked slightly flushed now, like she'd exerted herself. Empty, Maya said. Then, testing the feeling. But not bad empty. Just neutral. That will stabilize. Within a few hours, you'll feel normal. Happy, even. The weight you've been carrying will be gone completely. Irina stood slightly unsteady. Payment is due at the front desk. Do you have questions? Maya had hundreds of questions, but none of them seemed important anymore. She paid the receptionist $300, cash or card, and left the building feeling lighter than she had in months. By that evening, she realized lighter was an understatement. She felt good. Better than good. She felt like she had before Daniel got sick, before grief became her defining characteristic. She cleaned the house, made dinner, called Lucia, and told her she'd been right. The grief counselors worked. "You sound like yourself again," Lucia said, relief evident in her voice. "I feel like myself again. Better than myself. I can't believe I waited this long." Maya went back to work the following week. Her colleagues were cautious around her, tiptoeing around the subject of Daniel, offering condolences in hushed voices. She smiled and thanked them and moved on. She didn't need their sympathy. She didn't need anything. The problem started 3 weeks after the session. Maya was grading papers at her kitchen table when she realized she couldn't remember Daniel's voice. She knew intellectually that he'd had a voice, could recall the content of things he'd said, but the sound itself, the pitch, the cadence, the specific quality that made it his, was gone. She pulled up videos on her phone, watched recordings from his 7th birthday. He was speaking on camera, laughing, singing. But the sound felt generic, like it could be any child's voice. She went to the alleviation services office without an appointment. Irina saw her anyway, showed her into the same processing room. "I can't remember his voice," Maya said. "You took too much. We took what you asked us to take." Irina's expression was patient. "Grief. It's entangled with memory. Removing one affects the other. I want it back." "That's not possible. The grief has been consumed. It no longer exists to return." "Then I want to remember him properly. His voice, the way he laughed, those memories are still there," Irina interrupted. "But they're disconnected from emotional resonance. That's what grief is, Mrs. Cortez. The emotional weight of memory. We removed the weight. The memories remain, but lighter, easier to carry." Maya left the office feeling cheated, but she rationalized it. Some loss of detail was acceptable in exchange for functionality. She could live without remembering his voice perfectly. But the forgetting continued. A month later, she realized she couldn't picture his face clearly. Though photos helped, but when she tried to visualize Daniel without looking at images, the picture in her mind was vague, generic. Could be any dark-haired child. 2 months later, she couldn't remember the last thing he'd said to her. She knew they'd talked in the hospital the day before he died. Knew she'd held his hand. But the conversation itself was gone, replaced by blank space. Maya started taking notes, writing down everything she could remember before it disappeared. But the memories were slippery now, sliding away faster than she could record them. Soon she was left with facts. Daniel Cortez, born March 8th, died September 12th, like dinosaurs and swimming, but the person behind the facts was evaporating. She went back to alleviation services. Irina refused to see her. The receptionist explained that Mrs. Cortez's session had been completed successfully, and additional services were not needed. "I'm forgetting my son," Maya said. "You took too much. You asked us to take your grief. We did. The process is working as intended." Maya tried to make them understand. Started crying in the waiting room, begging to see Irina to discuss what was happening. Security escorted her out. She researched the grief eaters obsessively. Found forum posts from other people experiencing the same thing. Memories degrading. Loved ones fading. The grief removed, but everything else going with it. One post stood out. "They're not human. They're something else. They consume grief because grief is food for them. But they're not careful. They take too much. They're eating our ability to love, to remember, to connect. They're consuming what makes us human. Maya found the poster's name, Lisa Chen, Philadelphia. Lisa had used a similar service in her city, lost her father, used the grief eaters, started forgetting him. She'd been trying to investigate, to understand what these services actually were. Maya messaged her. They talked on the phone for 3 hours, comparing experiences, sharing research. Lisa had a theory. The grief eaters weren't human. They were something else, something that had found a niche feeding on human emotional pain. They'd set up shop in cities across the country, advertising as therapists, consuming grief and leaving clients empty. Empty of what? Maya asked. Everything that makes loss meaningful. Grief is how we honor the dead. It's the price of love. These things are taking our grief, but they're also taking our capacity to love, to connect, to care about anything deeply enough that its loss would hurt. Maya felt something shift in her chest. Not grief. She couldn't feel grief anymore, but a recognition that something essential had been stolen. She started tracking the grief eaters, found their offices in 15 cities across the Northeast, identical business models, always new in town, always producing miraculous results, and always, after a few months, reports of people who'd lost more than their grief, lost their memories, their connections, their ability to feel anything strongly. Maya went back to Alleviation Services one more time. She brought a camera, planning to document them, expose what they were doing. But when she arrived, the office was empty, cleared out overnight. The receptionist desk was bare. The processing rooms were stripped. They'd moved on, she realized. Once enough people caught on, they relocated, started over in a new city with new clients who were desperate enough to trade anything for relief from pain. Maya stood in the empty office and tried to summon grief. For Daniel, for herself, for all the people who'd been consumed by things pretending to help. She felt nothing. The memories were almost gone now. She knew she'd had a son, knew his name, but the person he'd been, the relationship they'd shared, the love that had defined her life for 7 years, all of it had been eaten by something that fed on human connection. She drove home, looked at photos of Daniel, tried to force herself to feel something. But you can't force grief any more than you can force love. Both require a capacity for emotional depth that the grief eaters had consumed. Maya sat at her kitchen table and wrote down everything she could remember, every detail, no matter how small. The facts of Daniel's existence, recorded before they vanished completely. When she was done, she put the notebook in a drawer. Someday, she thought, she might read it and understand what she'd lost. Might recognize that the person described in those pages had mattered to her once. But that day hadn't come yet. Maybe it never would. Because the grief eaters had consumed not just her pain, but her capacity to feel the absence of that pain. They'd left her functional but hollow, walking through a life that continued with offensive normalcy while everything that made her human had been carefully, systematically eaten away. She looked at a photo of Daniel, dark-haired boy smiling at the camera. He looked familiar, the way strangers sometimes look familiar, but she couldn't remember who he was to her, or why seeing his face should make her feel anything at all. The grief was gone, and so was everything else. Thank you for spending this time in the dark with me. These stories, like all the best horror, aren't really about the monsters. They're about the spaces between what we want and what we get, between safety and surrender, between the people we are and the people we're terrified of becoming. If these stories resonated with you, if you found something here that unsettled you in the right way, consider subscribing. We're here every week, waiting. Sleep well if you can. And if you can't, know that you're not alone in the stillness. This has been the Stillness Broadcast. Until next time, may your doors stay closed and your memories remain your own.